Appreciate being here. This is going to be a change-up because you're not going to learn a lot about connectivity, planning principles, how to do conditional use permit. We're not going to talk about any of that with this. We're going to talk about how you, serving on a board or a commission or a council, how do you make decisions? And how do you get to the decisions that you finally wind up at? And what's that all about? As some have mentioned, and I will tell you, it's been many years that I have been involved in planning, and I've been involved attending planning commission or council meetings for over 40 years, 40 plus years. And I've seen a lot of stuff happen in those meetings over those years. And it really kind of, we had all the planning related stuff, but it also got me to kind of thinking about how do they get to where they're at? Sometimes they're talking about something and they wind up a completely different place than where I thought they were going to wind up. Or something happens and I think, well, before the meeting I think, oh, well, this is what's going to happen at the meeting. And it doesn't happen at all. What in the heck is going on and how does that happen? And it kind of got me thinking about this and looking at it and trying to figure out what was going on. And I started doing a little bit of research on it, and I have to give credit to 3 particular books that have helped me a lot to understand a little bit of the dynamics about how groups make decisions and what's involved in that. These 3 books that you see up here on the screen. If you have any interest in this, grab them, because they are really interesting, really good stuff. And I'm going to take a lot of examples and a lot of information that is in these books to talk about a little bit here and illustrate some of the points that we're going to make. Since I did this, and over the time, and probably since the last time I did this in Spanish Fork and some other communities, I've found a couple of other resources that were really good. One is an article in The Economist magazine from 2015 that's called, it says, New Research Hints at Ways of Making Meetings More Effective. That sounds like the old, planning management speak, and it is, but this one really goes into a lot of interesting stuff that's related to this. And then I found another one about a book that was written by a guy named Noah Smith, reviewed that in the Tribune. It's called The Wisdom of the Crowd and the Madness of the Masses, which really helps a lot as well. And I'll use some of those examples from this as well. What's really interesting to me also about this is I put this together, and when I started giving this in some of the conferences and things, man, I had people that came up afterwards and said to me, oh, this is really good. Now I've always wondered what we're doing in our meetings and how things work and why it happens the way it does. And this is really good, and it's going to help me go back and do meetings better and so on and so forth. And that went on for a period of years. And now for several years, I haven't done this presentation at all, hardly at all. This year, this is about the 3rd or 4th time I've been asked to give it just this year. Something's going on, folks. Something's going on with the way people interact and the way we talk to each other and how we do things that I think has got people back interested in this topic. And just to take a look at it. So let's go through this. We'll go through this fairly quickly. And then just to give you an idea, I think, I don't know where Dave went. But Dave, I think after this we're going to have a discussion, right? A little broader discussion, Ed and myself, and whatever issues and topics. So we'll kind of play with that. All right, let's start off. We're going to start back in 1906. There's a guy who remember that year, Will? Yes, so I do. Back in 1906, there was a gentleman by the name of Francis Galton. He was actually a scientist of heredity and statistics and probabilities, and had done a lot of groundbreaking research and work in this. And he, at this point in 1806, he was 85 years old. And as many people in the English gentry, you might speak, or kind of in that English society, he had been thinking about a lot of stuff. And one of the things he thought about He thought this whole system of voting, of asking people to cast votes in democratic elections, was a terrible idea. But it's a stupid idea. Because you're asking people to vote on things they don't know anything about. And so you're just going to get dumb decisions. And I can already see some of you out there going, yeah, that's right. I agree. And so he kind of came up with his experience and background. He came up with an idea about proving it. He was going to prove how people make dumb decisions. So what he did was he was going to go to English country fairs, which were a big thing back then, and probably still are to some extent. We have county fairs. They called them their English country fairs. And he was going to go to these and prove what he was thinking, that getting people to cast votes on things they didn't know anything about was a dumb idea. It wasn't a good way to run things. At each country fair, back in those days, there was, one of the features of it was that they would have a livestock weight guessing contest. They would have a cow or an ox or some other large livestock on display there, and people would enter a contest to guess how much that specimen of livestock weighed. And at the end, the guess that was the closest to the actual weight would win a prize of some kind. I don't know if they actually won the cow or the ox. I don't think they did. But they would win prizes. And Dalton figured, you know, most of the people that go to country fairs, they don't know anything about livestock. Yeah, there's a few people there who do. There's probably obviously some farmers and some animal husbandry people and some veterinarians and some folks that probably know something about livestock. But most of the people that go there don't know anything about livestock. So they're going to make terrible guesses. And because of his background in statistics and probabilities and so on, he was going to perform a test on these guesses and figure out and show and demonstrate that the crowd was actually not very good at guessing what the actual weight of the livestock was. He figured that big crowd would do that. So he was going to take a look at that. What he did was he went to the organizers. He asked them if, following their contest, if he could have all the tickets. Now, the way this worked was that a person would buy a ticket from the organizer, from the person who was running this, write their weight of the guess on it, and then put it in the box. And so they had all the tickets there, and he asked the organizers, he said, can I have your tickets? And they would give him all the tickets after the contest was all over and everything. And then he ran statistics on this to show that people didn't know anything and really weren't very good at this. And so at this particular fair in Plymouth, this day, which was his first one, he did this statistical analysis. The ox that they had at the fair that day weighed 1,198 pounds. The average of all of the guesses that were cast that day at the fair was 1,197 pounds. It was within 1 pound of the actual weight of the ox. It's a fluke. And he went to many other country fairs. They all worked out about the same. That the average or the statistical analysis of the guesses that were made were all within very close limits of what the actual weight of the livestock was. Well, he didn't get that. But some people now call that, it's the wisdom of the crowd. It's the wisdom of the crowd. In another, one of the other books, the Swarm book that was up there, Len Fisher, who's the author of that book, in writing his book and doing the research for it and all of that he did there, he took a jar of jelly beans into pubs in London and went around inside the pubs and asked people to guess how many jelly beans he had in his jar. And he did a similar kind of thing. And just as an example, the range of guesses that he got on his jar of jelly beans was from 41 to 93. The average of all the guesses was 60. The number of jelly beans he actually had in the jar was 61. Same thing happened with him. Columbia Business School, there was a professor that had one of these big, classes, people sitting in the tiered rows and everything. And every year, he would ask the members of his class, which numbered hundreds of students, he would say, when the Academy Award time came around and the nominations were made, he would have his students guess the winners in the 12 major categories of the Academy Awards. None of the students ever got more than about 5 of the winners correct. But overall, as a class, every year they got around 11 of 12 right. So something's going on here. And how does this work? How can it work? Well, so there's been a bunch of research that's been done on this to kind of find out the parameters of this wisdom of the crowds thing, the wisdom of the crowd. And it's been found that these kind of results for a variety of different things will generally hold true if there are 3 conditions that are met. 3 main conditions. Let's talk about what those 3 conditions are. First one is diversity. Your crowd or your group, studies have shown that having a wide diversity of people in a group makes the group smarter, more likely to come up with the good or the right answer. Uniform groups generally do not. Why? Why do you think?
They think too much alike.
They think too much alike. They make the same kinds of mistakes. They have the same kinds of biases, which kind of leads them all to think in one direction and not think of other alternatives or other ways of looking at things. And so generally, that is one of the requirements or one of the things that needs to be true in order for this to really work, this wisdom of the crowds. In Galton's experiment, you had all these people that were going to the country fair. You had a few, like I said, butchers in there and farmers and other people that may have some knowledge about livestock, but not a lot. Most of the people were, had all kinds of backgrounds. And so when they all made their guesses, what you wind up with is a wide range. But when you look at right in the middle, it's right about where that answer is pretty much what it should be. And so that's really kind of where it is. So,
Are we thinking about engagement? Are we thinking about community form? Are we thinking about political discourse? Or are we thinking about all the above?
All the above. And we'll talk a little bit about how some of that works as we get into this. So, I've got a picture there of a broad, diverse group of people versus a picture of these, remember in the 1960s, the NASA scientists, Apollo 13, right? These guys all wore white shirts, skinny ties, crew cut haircuts, they were really alike, right? These guys were amazingly successful. How did that turn? We'll talk about them a little bit more, just what diversity means. The second condition is that the individuals in the group have to make their conclusions independently. Their thoughts, not somebody else's thoughts. At the English Country Fair, a person bought a ticket, would take that ticket and would write his guess on it, his or her guess on it by themselves, and drop it in the box. Why is that important? Well, one of the reasons why that's important is because it lets you put down what you do think and not be afraid of looking stupid to somebody. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail about how this kind of works. But you're not worried about, well, if I put that answer down, somebody's going to think I'm really stupid. I don't know what I'm talking about. So it's really important that you have to have that, making those conclusions independently, and we'll talk about what that means. And the third one is the way you aggregate the choices, the way you collect or people express their opinions. Again, it has to do with that issue of are people watching you, are they judging you, about what you come up with and what you might say or what you think. The bottom line is that being allowed to express your opinion or to make your judgment anonymously works the best. In the English Country Fair example, it was people writing that ticket in and putting it in the box. Nobody saw it. And we'll talk about that a little bit, how that may work. All right, that's what happens. That's how it works with this wisdom of the crowds concept. And generally, this works pretty well when you have a lot of people that are really diverse that do all of these things, because, as we mentioned, you're going to get a broad range of choices. But you narrow it down, or you bring it all together, and it comes out here, which tends to be more often than not the right or the best answer, or something that really seems to work pretty well. Now, that's with big groups. You guys are all on planning commissions or on councils. That's not a big group. You have maybe, what, 7 people, 5 people, 7 people, maybe 9 in some cases. A few that are bigger than that, but generally not many. So that's a little bit different than what we are talking about with this big wisdom of the crowds kind of thing. Do those principles that we just talked about hold for making decisions in those smaller groups? Yes, it turns out mostly it does. But there are some things we have to be aware of because the dynamics are different, because we're a small group now. And the interactions are different, and just how things occur is different. So let's talk about what those differences are, or what those things we need to be aware of. First, we'll talk about this issue of diversity. Again, for a small group, diversity is important. It's really key. It's really one of the key things. The diversity of background, of age, of experience. It's really important in small groups, just like it is in that bigger wisdom of crowds. Numerous studies in these books that I showed you, they cite numerous studies that have been done to show that diverse groups do better than uniform groups. In one set of experiments, they had a bunch of people come in, and they would give them a set of problems to solve, various kinds of things. It might be mathematical problems, or they had some other kinds of problems for them to work out and see how they did. Some people did well, some people didn't do so well. And then they had those people in, and they knew who they were and how they did. And then they mixed these people up into groups and put these people into groups and said, okay, here's another set of problems. Work the problems out as a group. You might be a little more effective at it. And so they did. Now, the researchers deliberately put the people together in 3 different types of groups. A group that was made up of all people that were good at solving the problems. A group that was made up of all people that were not good at solving the problems. And groups that were made up of people that were a mix. Some good, some bad. Which groups do you think did the best? Not the group of all good problem solvers. The mixed groups did the best. Now, why would that be? Well, we already talked about that a little bit, because the problems are not always identical, and they may be a little bit different. And people, again, they come at it from a different viewpoint, a different experience, a different background, and they may actually see something that everybody who maybe is good at doing things a certain way may not see. And so that really, it makes the group better or smarter.
Well,
yes.
If I can interject,
Please do.
I have found this to be totally true. I've been in the planning world for a long time, and I've been on my planning commission for an embarrassingly long time. I think 8 years. And we'll get new planning commissioners that come in, and they're nervous a little bit about saying what they think. And I encourage them to speak up. And what I find is that sometimes, like, before they've figured out whatever the party line is or what the culture is of the commission, that they're asking like these questions that you just wouldn't think of, and that they shed some light on an issue just in a different way. And it's kind of golden.
Yeah.
And let me tell you about one of the perhaps the most famous planner mind in American history, a woman named Jane Jacobs. She was not a planner.
Yeah.
And what she did is she observed the world around her, and she formed opinions, and then she wrote about it. We are an industry, I think every industry is in this, like, pat yourself on the back itis for how much you know. We do actually have to really, like, it's not just diversity, but it's, and you know, those that are good and maybe not as good, but it's looking for that in each other a little bit too, so sorry for the.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, what that really, I mean, I think a lot of us would have the idea of, if you want to accomplish something in a group, get all the experts on the group, right? The people that are good at this, the people who know something about this, put them on the group and they'll solve the problem for us. I think a lot of us have that mindset. But that one book, The Wisdom of Crowds, actually spends a fair amount of time kind of demonstrating that experts aren't really all that good. They don't really know that, or they really don't, when I say they don't know, they do seem to know a lot, probably a lot more than many of us, average, that aren't expert in that field, but they generally don't have outcomes that are that much better than a group of people that is a little bit more diverse. What does that mean for your planning commission? You know, I have heard mayors and council members, because they appoint the planning commission, we're stuck with our councils, folks. We don't get to, well, we do get to choose them, they get to be elected. But you know, if Dalton's right, then the election should turn out pretty good. But every once in a while, it seems like you get, I don't know, something in there. But the councils appoint the planning commissioners. And I have heard council members and mayors say, well, we want to make sure we get the best people on our planning commission. The real estate attorney, the planner, the real estate developers, somebody people who work in this area or know something about this area, that's what we need on our planning commission. And what this information, what this evidence suggests is that's not the right answer. Yes, it helps to have one or two on the commission that have some expertise and background in that experience, in that area. But it really helps, from what all of these various studies have shown, to have a diverse group of people. So get the plumber from down the street, or the soccer mom who lives over here, or get the accountant at the business over here. Get a diverse group of people on your planning commission. And the evidence is that you'll probably wind up getting better decisions, getting good decisions. Just to kind of demonstrate that versus, you know, the diversity or a larger group versus experts. How many of you remember that show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You all kind of remember that show? And the person that they were answering these questions, if they got stuck, they had 3 lifelines. One of the lifelines was to eliminate 2 of the answers, or one of the answers, and then guess, or a couple of the answers, and there were a couple answers left, whatever that was. Okay, that's one. You narrow it down to the probabilities. But the other 2 lifelines, one was that the person could call a friend, call somebody they thought knew something about the subject of the question they were being asked. The second was to ask the audience to express their opinion on what the right answer was. The statistics on the turnout when they did that, calling the expert friend, got the answer on that show overall, got the right answer 60% of the time. The audience expressed what the right answer was. They got it right 90% of the time. Just a little bit of an indicator that getting people that are diverse or a group on there is good. Remember that picture I had up there of the NASA scientists? And how I said, boy, those guys are one of the most uniform-looking bunches of people that you might ever see anywhere. They're not very diverse. What they accomplished was remarkable. They basically went from ground zero, or standing start, to landing men or people on the moon and having them walk around up there in about 7 years. That's remarkable. You think we could do that today? You look at these guys and you think, well, yeah, but they were so uniform. How did they accomplish it? They were not uniform. They were not uniform. in the early 60s, you had aeronautical engineers, but they weren't called aeronautical engineers, but they dealt mainly with the design of airplanes. So you kind of had that, but they're now called aeronautical engineers too, but they're really into the whole space thing. But that whole line of expertise didn't exist then. The people that they recruited and put into NASA, a lot of them were engineers. Most of them were engineers. So you think, oh, they're all engineers, they're all alike. They weren't alike. You had electrical engineers, structural engineers, mechanical engineers, chemical engineers, civil engineers. You have engineers with a wide diversity of backgrounds. And if you've watched that movie, Apollo 13, when it came down to they had to figure out how to try to fix some things way up there in space, I mean, those guys were like brainstorming like crazy and coming up with various things to try and do. The diversity of backgrounds seemed to work really well. Conversely, when the shuttle disaster happened, one of these books spends quite a bit of time talking about the study, a couple of studies that were done. You look at the engineers that existed at the time of the space shuttle. They look way more diverse. You know, you've got everything from the hiker, granola type, whatever you want to call it, to the guys in the business suits, to women and minorities and everybody. They don't look uniform at all. But most of those engineers went to the same 4 graduate schools of business, or of engineering, sorry, of aeronautical engineering. Basically all learned the same techniques and the same methods, and were in that hierarchical system that if they disagreed with the folks above them, they figured that their careers were probably going to end. And so they kind of towed the line. And they were not diverse, not nearly as diverse as that original group of NASA engineers. And as I say, one of those books talks a fair amount about that and really makes the case and says it was that lack of diversity that really helped to create what became the disaster of the shuttle at some point in time. So diversity is an important point. Now, you want to talk about diversity. If you have somebody that's diverse in your group, what that means is that probably at some point, somebody's going to disagree with the group. Ted kind of expressed it. He says, you know, they bring up different ideas, maybe a different way of looking at things or seeing things. Sometimes you just call that a difference of opinion. Sometimes it's called dissent. It's not agreeing with what the group as a whole really encourages. You know, you're at a planning commission meeting, right? It's getting late. It's 11 o'clock. You guys have gone through a bunch of stuff. And, you know, you just want to get out of there. It's time to go home. Dave just told me that they've had some meetings that went till 1:30 in the morning. Holy cow. So let's get rid of that last item. Get it done and get out of here. All right, what do everybody think? Oh yeah, I think I'll go there. Yeah, okay, that sounds good to me. Let's get ready. Anybody want to make a motion? And then one of the commissioners goes, yeah, well, you know what? I see this a little different. And the rest of the group goes, it's time to go home.
So if you're the planning commission chair, how do you provide space for dissent? And one of your earlier points, how do you provide space for independent thinking?
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit. That's an important thing to do. Dissent plays a number of useful roles in a group and in the decision-making process. One of them is probably the obvious one. Somebody brings information out that the rest of you hadn't thought about. Oh, I didn't even think of that. When I was in Salt Lake City, we had a planning commission meeting where we were reviewing a small subdivision, and it was kind of an infill project, so it was on a relatively small piece of property, but they were putting several houses in, kind of around an access road, and they normally would have had to put in, you know, the full access road with a cul-de-sac. The Salt Lake City's regulations allowed for some varying of those requirements if they would do some other things, like provide some other benefits and so on. And so this particular developer was showing a different kind of a design for that that little piece of property, or that relatively was several, about 3 or 4 houses around it, and was going to put in a smaller access road with more of like a hammerhead and some differences in there. And it was at the discretion of the planning commission to approve it. And the discussion got started on it, and the discussion was going along, and as they were talking about, oh, this is not, that's not a good idea, because I've got people like that, that's just, I wouldn't want to drive up into there and do this and that, and the fire truck might get stuck up there, and this might happen, and that might happen, and I thought, no, they're not going to approve this. And then one of the planning commissioners said, well, you know what, I was visiting my son or daughter somewhere, and there was a neighborhood right by their house, and they had a situation like this. It was kind of developed like this. And they had provided a place and a way for them to bring like all their garbage cans to one location, and they had a place where they could gather and do the mail, and they had this, and they had various other features around it. And he said, I thought it worked really well. I thought it was actually kind of a cool little neighborhood. He brought that up. Next thing I know, the planning commission's going, oh, well, it sounds like not a bad idea. Boom, they switched. They completely turned around, and they wound up approving it. One person did that, kind of got that to change like that. Again, studies in these books that I was talking about. One particular study that was done back in the 60s and I guess in the 70s, kind of a popular thing to do was people would get together and they would form what were called investment clubs. People would get together and they would say, let's all throw in some money and we'll buy some stocks, and then we'll all we'll decide what stocks to buy as a group, and then we'll reap the benefits. And I guess it was a popular thing, something that people did at one point in time. So some social scientists did some studies of some of these investment groups to see which ones did better. Again, guess which ones did better? Was it the group where everybody got together, they were all good friends, they all sat together, somebody said, let's do this. Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, I like that. Sure. Let's do this. Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, everybody agreed. Then there were some investment groups where they would argue with each other. I think we ought to buy this stock. Well, why would you want to buy that stock? Come on, justify it. No, I think that's a dumb idea because of this and this. And they would argue and fight and contend back and forth before they finally decided on what investments they were going to make. Once again, you've heard me say this before, which group do you think did better? The ones that were contending and having a lot of discussion about it. They wound up doing better in the investments that they made than the groups that all just kind of, everybody went along to get along and just decided, yeah, good, cool, let's just do that. What somebody suggests, let's just do that. So again, dissent per se is not a virtue in and of itself, but it can lead to some better outcomes if it's done in a good way and a right way. One way not to do it is, don't be this guy, right? This is the guy that disagrees with everything. He never agrees with what the rest of the group wants to do or thinks. And not only does he not agree, but he's a bugger. He's not very likable. Yes, that is a dissenter. Yes, that's someone who might just be bringing forward some information or some viewpoints or some things that maybe you had considered or that would be valuable to consider. But you know what? People aren't going to listen to this person after a while because you just don't like him. You don't like him, you don't like the way he does things, and a lot of times he turns out to be wrong, and so we're just not going to listen to this guy at all. So that's not the way to do dissent. Do it in a way that's respectful and can really accomplish something. Yeah, Jason.
So I think there's another way to look at this is the difference between confrontation and contention.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of us, not even just with each other, but with the public, I think it's important to try and discern is this person confronting an issue, or are they just creating contention there to just try and blow up the process and make everybody look bad and make it painful and long and ugly.
And they don't like some of the people there.
Right, so
Yeah.
I think that's another way to look at it in discerning the jobs that we do. Is this contention just making it hard, or is this confronting the issue and bringing a different perspective to the table?
Yep. Here's one example we call it that. Any of you here seen the movie or the play 12 Angry Men? Okay, a number of you have. It's a great old Henry Fonda movie, if you haven't seen it. It's about a young guy who's on trial for I think, killing somebody. And the jury that's brought in, and this whole thing's kind of going down fairly quickly, and the jury that's brought in, they're all like, a couple of the guys they want to get out of there and get to a ball game later that afternoon, and other people are just like, they've got their own issues and problems, and they really don't care what's going on, and so they're just like, yeah, let's just get out of here, let's just, it's obvious the guy's guilty, let's just vote him guilty and get out of here. The jury has to be unanimous, and Henry Fonda plays the guy on the jury who he's thinking about this. And he starts raising questions, and people get mad at him, and people are upset with him because he's stretching things out and so on and so forth. But as he raises the various things that he's thinking about and looking at, and one by one, he turns the jury members around to the point that by the end, he's got them all turned around. Now, I don't know how realistic that is, to be able to do that. But the point is that by good, different from the contrarian, by good, thoughtful, reasoned questioning, dissenting, you may turn a decision around to do something, be something in a way that might work out a little better, maybe more correct. All right, that next provision. Making your conclusions independently. Your idea, not somebody else's. All right, Len Fisher, again with that jar of jelly beans, goes into the pubs. And this time, instead of asking individual people, he goes to tables, like you guys, right? And he says, here's a jar of jelly beans. You as a group, tell me how many, you come up with an agreed upon number of how many jelly beans are in that jar. And he did that numerous times out throughout the city of London. What he found was that he got ranges that were much smaller. The range in this particular case was 97 to 112, so not a real big range. The average of the guesses for the number of jelly beans in his jar was 105. The actual number in the jar was 147. It was way off this time. What happened? What happened?
Didn't have the anonymity.
They didn't have anonymity, and they were working on it as a group. What that really almost suggests is, certainly when those people were asked to do that as a group at the table, they talked about it, right? And they came up with a decision as a group as to what the answer ought to be. Isn't that what we do at our meetings? It kind of suggests that having discussions about dealing with these things makes your group dumber. Does that mean we shouldn't have discussions? Just go straight to a vote without talking about it?
Have any of you tried I wonder if any of you have tried these things like, okay, so you have the staff report, the planner gets up, gives a presentation, maybe you turn to the developer and say, anything you want to add, and then just have each person form their own opinion? I mean, is this what this means?
Yeah.
Maybe you start with a straw poll. Who's thinking this or that, or how do we keep from influencing each other right off the bat? I struggle with that.
Since Ted threw this out, I'm gonna kind of give away an answer here early, or right up front. There are one of these articles that I talked about, this one in The Economist. Let me just see if, in order, when a group gets together, discusses, and they have the information presented to them or whatever it is that they're going to be talking about, making decisions about. First, they should follow Mr. Kahneman's advice, and every participant should note their views in advance. So before you have any discussion, what this says is write down what you think. And then you've got it right there for reference. So that you can say, okay, this is what I think, and this is what I thought, right from the very beginning, all right? There are things that happen when a group starts discussing that influence how the decision's made, and oftentimes skew the result. What it's helpful for you as individuals in a group is to understand what those things are, so that you can maybe recognize what's going on and saying, oh, wait a minute, I see what's happening here. I gotta be careful about where I go with this. Let's talk about what some of those are. First one is what's called a cascade. A cascade frequently happens in groups when you start discussing something, one person starts the line of thought, and wow, everybody cascades right along. It's kind of, when I was a kid, we used to go to downtown Salt Lake. I grew up near Liberty Park in Salt Lake City, and we used to go to downtown Salt Lake to go to the movies. And we used to do this sometimes when we were downtown. In those days, maybe it's getting that way again, downtown Salt Lake City streets were pretty busy. There were a lot of people walking there. Maybe it's getting that way again now. Not that the pandemic's over, but there were so many people on the sidewalk, and so we as kids would do something. We would stop on the sidewalk and we'd look up. Wow. And people go by on the sidewalk, and pretty soon there was a crowd there looking up. And at that point, we took off, laughing. Well, it's kind of a similar kind of thing. It's a cascade. More often than not, studies have shown that the first speaker in an issue, in a group, the decision or the result of what comes out of that group is what the first speaker said. More often than not. Not always, but more often than not.
I think we know this too.
Yeah.
I mean, don't raise your hands, but how many of you think you've used this to your advantage?
Yeah. That's one thing that I say as I talk about this is if you really want to influence the group and get your decision made, talk out early, speak out early. Speak up, right up front. Because more often than not, the decisions go the way of the first speaker or the early speakers. Now, why does that happen? Why does that happen? And it's helpful to understand why that maybe happens. The first one is uncertainty. You're sitting there, you've heard this, you're listening to this, you're thinking, I don't know, I'm not really sure what to think about this. And then somebody speaks up and says, well, this is what I think. And you go, yeah, sure, sounds good to me, okay. Happens more often than you might think. Another reason is social. You're sitting there, you have some ideas and thoughts about what you think maybe ought to happen. The first speaker, a person speaks up and says, okay, well, this is what I think about this. This is maybe what should happen. And you're a nice person. And you go, oh, yeah, sure, okay. I'm not going to, contradict him. Yeah, sure, I'll go along with that. Why not? I like him. I want to be friends. I'm not going to contradict him. Kind of related to that is that oftentimes the person that may speak up first is someone that maybe is perceived as, and you all perceive them as, that person knows something. Maybe that person is the expert. Maybe that person has more background in this than the rest of us, and so you go, I should follow what that person says. That person knows more than any of the rest of us about this. Whether that's true or not, the perception is there. And the other one is just the pressure to conform. That first person says, this is what I think. And then somebody else speaks up and says, yeah, I think that too. And then somebody else speaks up and says, yeah, I agree with that. And then you're sitting there going, Well, I'm not going to disagree now. Everybody else is going this direction. I'll just go that direction too. Those are the kinds of things that happen when these discussions get underway. It's good to recognize that because you shouldn't let it influence you. That's why I read you that piece from the Economist article which says, before any discussion gets going, write down what you think. You know, we really ought to be encouraging, maybe our chairs, we ought to have the chairs of our commissions kind of start this thing and say, all right, we've heard from, you know, we've heard the issues, we've heard what this is all about. Before we have any discussion on this, write down what you think. And then you've got it right there, and you can refer back to it. And it may be something that will help you during the discussion that rolls along. Okay, here's a warning. Dave will like this, and Jason will like this. Staff are early speakers. Who do you usually hear from first? The staff. That's not necessarily so bad when you're talking about an administrative item, like a conditional use permit or a subdivision approval or something like that, because in those cases, the staff is supposed to be checking off the boxes for you. They did this, this is what's required in our code or our ordinance, they did this, they did this, they did this, they did this, they didn't do this. And so in that regard, they're giving you information, which you then use to make the ultimate decision. That's not so bad. Where it really is a little bit more iffy is when you're talking about those items that are not administrative, the legislative items that we call them. The adoption or the amending of your general plan, the adoption or the amending of your land use ordinances, the rezoning of property, the annexation of property to your community. Those are the kinds of things. They're much more opinion-based. They're much more like, is this a good idea or not? Staff may have a good idea, but as we just talked about in this diversity thing and about the wisdom of the crowd, everybody's idea has a fair amount of validity here. And so it's a little bit more sketchy about whether it's a good idea to have staff speak early and let that influence. Just be aware about how that might play into as you make your considerations. Yes?
So my experience in different jurisdictions has been that staff writes a recommendation. I've seen a couple of different things. I've seen where staff has written recommend approval, recommend deny, or they give you all the different options. There have been sort of other places where the staff has said, we recommend approval or we recommend denial. So that's even before the discussion from the staff. So we as a planning commission are to be looking at that, already knowing what the staff's
Right up front.
thinking before they have a chance to speak with the public.
That's a really good point. And it's really something to be aware of as you look through these things. What that really kind of means is your thoughts or ideas are not invalid, even though the staff may be recommending something else or whatever. But you need to think about it. You need to look through it carefully. Of course, the public too. We usually let the public in public hearing, right? Before you guys get to talk about it, staff does their thing, and we usually have the public get up and say their thing. And do we get a good cross-section of when the public's there? No, usually we get people that are pretty much, they're there against it, right? We're against this. That's usually why the public is there. Not always, but most of the time. And so you kind of got to take that into account. You know, I love to say this, but over the years, I've pretty much figured out that in every public hearing that you have, no matter what the issue is, you get three things from the public. One is it's going to lower my property values, no matter what it is. It's going to lower my property values. Number two, it's going to increase traffic. And number three, children will die. Happens in every public hearing, right? I got to tell you, so as mentioned, I'm on my planning commission, on the planning commission in Kaysville where I live. And I had just talked to one of my fellow planning commissioners about this, saying that we had a rezone proposal on where there was just, they wanted to rezone an existing house. It's a commercial, which is right across the street from the commercial, and kind of turn that into a really kind of a low-key office is what they wanted to do. And people that were there were complaining about people from the office, the commercial area over here were parking on the streets, and now there would be more people parking on the streets, and that they're off. And then it happened. People said, and kids are going to run out from between those cars to get to the park across the street, and they're going to get hit. And I turned to my fellow planning commissioner and said, told you, kids are going to die. Happens everywhere. Anyway, okay. Just be aware that the public is also early speakers and how that might affect. All right, another issue is doing sequential voting. We'll talk about this more as we talk about how you express your opinion, which is that third principle. But what I really needed here was a video of these ladies voting. You can see the lady in the black on the far side there. She's got her hand up. She's voting. The other ladies are like, okay, maybe I'll vote that way too. But the early voters oftentimes influence what the others are going to do. Because if they vote for or against, others oftentimes just follow along. And so that's really kind of an argument, and we'll make another argument for why this idea of sequential voting in your meetings is really not a good idea, because it doesn't really get you the best decision. And we'll talk about some more of the details of that as we get into this. Another one is how the group can influence individuals in the group to change, to not think what they were thinking. Great experiment, again, talked about in one of these books, where you have lines of different length, and they brought people in and they asked them to determine, and sometimes they have lines on them and so on, which you can get these optical illusions which make lines look shorter or longer, but people can, oftentimes figure that out and decide. So people were brought in, they were asked to look at these lines and indicate whether these pairs of lines were the same length or not the same length. And what they found, as they had these people come in, 95% of the time, people got the right answer. Or I guess it was 90, was it 90%? 95% of the time. They got the right answer as to which ones were shorter or longer. Then they started pairing people up and having people kind of decide this together. And what they did was is that the person that they paired these individuals up with were actors. And they would deliberately give the wrong answer as to whether they thought it was shorter or longer. Those people that had been answering the right answer, or giving the right answer 95% of the time, when they got paired up with somebody who was a little bit more aggressive or a little bit forward about saying, oh yeah, I think those are not the same length, or yes, those are the same length. Now the results from those individuals who were getting it right 95% of the time went to 25% of the time. That is a big difference. And it was primarily due to this influence of another individual there with them. What was really interesting about this was that the social scientists were thinking that it's the social function, right? They don't want to be disagreeable to that other person. Or, they're doing it for all those reasons about, maybe they're not certain, they're going to go along, they're going to do all these other things, and not be disagreeable or whatever. They actually conducted some of these studies using the technique of fMRI, where you could actually see the active brain areas. And they figured that it would be the social area of the brain that would be lighting up as they were being told the wrong answers, and then they would give the wrong answers. It wasn't. It was the cognitive area of the brain. What that meant is that people were actually believing now the wrong answers.
We never see that.
Yeah.
We do see that.
They had actually now changed their cognition and were thinking that those were the answers and they were not the right answers. So it's really interesting what the influence of groups can be. Another interesting factor, something to be aware of, is what's called group polarization. And that's where, when you're in a group, usually when you're in a group of people, you kind of have a sense of your place in that group. I'm kind of in the middle. I kind of go along with some things and I don't go along with some things. I'm kind of out on this one end. I oftentimes will disagree or have a different idea about this. You kind of have an idea of where you are in that group. Groups sometimes as a whole will shift their position, and interestingly enough, all of the individuals shift right along with it and don't even realize that they're shifting. And that happens when you do things like this. Somebody comes in and they say, you know, okay, here's what's happening, and somebody says, well, here's what I think. And then the next person speaks up and says, I think that too, and I think it more than he does. And then the next one says, yeah, well, I think so even more than you do, and it just keeps getting, pretty soon the whole group is just getting more to the extreme. This is kind of reflected in something that's called the severity shift in juries. I got to explain the picture. Some of you may remember back a number of years ago, Michael Vick, who was a quarterback in the NFL, and he was charged and convicted of running dog fighting bets, things. It was cruel to the dogs, and he really got into, his reputation took a real beating for this. What this picture shows is, well, what happened to Michael Vick if all of the jurors had been dogs, right? Because of what he was doing. Studies had been done, and it's been done several times, and it goes along with this thing. How many of you remember probably the most iconic cases where McDonald's was sued by somebody because they had spilled a hot cup of coffee in their lap, right? Yeah, I mean, that's not fun, and can be bad. And then when the decision of the jury came back, along with the penalty that was to be awarded, $5 million. And everybody's going, what? $5 million for spilling a cup of coffee in your lap? And it was this kind of thing. Well, this is what oftentimes happens, what they call a severity shift in juries. And there were some studies that were done where they would talk to the jurors before they would decide the penalty. When the jury had made a decision, and then the researchers were allowed to ask the jurors, what do you think the penalty ought to be? And they would get the answers from each of the individual jurors. And then the jury would go back in, and then they would deliberate on the penalty, and then they would come back out with the penalty. And the penalty was way over here, way worse than what any single individual juror, when they answered the question of the researcher, was. How in the heck does that happen? It's because you have this shifting of the group. Let me give you an example that might happen in your own meetings. You have a requirement for landscaping adjacent of a commercial area adjacent to residential, right? And you've got some flexibility about what kind of landscaping you can require. And so you're looking at this and you start thinking, yeah, we put some shrubs in and I think, yeah, we need to put some trees in there. Yeah, I agree, says the next person. And they need to be 1-inch caliber trees. And then the next person says, yeah, I think they need to be a little bigger. They ought to be, by the time that the commission's done, you're having them install full-grown redwood trees. It's that shift that happens. Beware of that. It's called group polarization or a shifting of the group. So really what we need to have happen, and this applies as I thought about this, because I put these slides together, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. But as I thought about this is we need to keep our groups from polarizing. We need to depolarize our groups. Wouldn't that be good for our politics, too? How do you depolarize a group? Well, again, the studies show that probably one of the most effective ways to keep a group from polarizing or to depolarize that group is to have a single dissenter. A single person who disagrees. One person can do that. And so that's, again, where it's important to have that diversity in your groups so that you kind of keep from getting everybody thinking the same way and going the same direction and maybe, therefore, getting a more reasonable answer. So what's the role of discussion? When you have to be aware of all of these things, is discussion a bad thing? Not necessarily. Just keep these things in mind. Discussion can be good for several things. One is it can give you more information than you had. Somebody knows something about what is being talked about that you didn't know. Oh, cool. Okay, that's information, something good that will help you to maybe make a better decision or a better outcome. On the policies issues, it's a little bit more dubious. But it can maybe help you think about, one of the important things that the center does is that not only for all those other reasons that we talked about, but it can help you to think through more thoroughly why you think the way you do. Why do I think, he doesn't think that's the right way to go. Why do I think it is? And then maybe you think through or thoroughly as to why you think that's the right answer. And you may come out saying, yeah, I think I still have the right answer. And that's fine. And you've at least examined it more closely because of the questions that were raised. And so from that, just be aware of that. That's how discussion can help. But don't let it sway you to maybe do something you wouldn't do. Once again, write down what you thought right at the beginning and look at it and say, was I wrong? Maybe not. Or maybe so. It's based on what we've talked about here, but have it there in front of you and don't get dissuaded just by all the other reasons that we just talked about. Okay, the last thing to talk about is how you make your decision. We already talked about the sequential voting thing, but really the key thing is people will give their real opinion, their real thing, if they're screened or protected from having other people know what they're deciding. What that really says is the best way, or the way to get the best answer from people is to allow them to make those decisions anonymously. We can't do that. Because state code requires that on decisions that are made, the vote of every individual member is to be recorded in the minutes. Okay, so it's going to get out there sooner or later.
And maybe we save this for our open discussion, but what about the public hearing in all of this? It's talk about the early voice and talk about the lack of psychological safety of somebody at the center coming up and saying something contrary to that will of the room. I mean, it's kind of a disaster when you're contrasting it against these principles,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's not clear cut. You're absolutely right, Dave. But so, if anonymous is the best way to do this, we can't do that because our votes have to be recorded in the minutes. There are maybe some things that we can do to let this work a little bit better. We talked about the sequential voting. If you're doing that, cut it out because it really just kind of goes along with that whole cascade effect of how people maybe make decisions. The people that are later on down the line, they may not know what to think, or they may not want to contradict what everybody else is voting, or they want to be part of the group, and they're not going to vote differently because they want to be part of the group. And so there's all those reasons why they shouldn't do that. Maybe the best thing to do is to have people, when it comes time to vote, you've got a motion and a second, now you vote. Maybe what you do is you hand out slips of paper, you have people write down what their vote is, have them collected by the commission secretary or something, who tallies them and then announces what the result is. Okay? This motion passed. And could even announce maybe what the vote was. But doesn't necessarily have to say who voted what way. Because it doesn't say it has to be done in the meeting, it has to be in the minutes. So, that kind of, it doesn't completely put off that letting other people know how stupid you are for the decision you made, the vote you cast. But you're not going to get it right there, right then at the meeting, so maybe that's a way to do it. At the very least, the best thing to do, if you're not going to do that, is just, all in favor say aye, all opposed say nay. That's probably the way we're going to do it most of the time. It probably gets very close. But I kind of like the idea of writing it down on slips of paper and kind of vote. But I don't know of anybody who does that. Yes?
Question, is there anything in state law that requires planning commissions to do a roll call vote?
No. There's nothing in state law that requires that.
Okay.
When you do the vote, you always have to say all in favor, say aye first, or can you try to keep as many as you do first?
You could definitely do it the other way around. There's nothing sacred about the order. It's just tradition that we do it that way. And another thing is we talk about that tradition idea. if you are going to have sequential voting, and I know some people, some commissions seem to be really wedded to it. The planning commission I serve on, I've suggested several times they do sequential voting, and I suggested several times we ought to stop doing that, but we still do it. At the very least, though, they now do it. They start randomly, right? So the chair will say, "Okay, let's start the vote." Wilf Sommerkorn, what's your vote? And then they'll go down the line that way, or random it up. So that would help. I just assume they'd do away with sequential voting altogether.
Quick suggestion, you mentioned earlier that people maybe write down their thoughts before the discussion. Maybe you ask people, write down your vote,
Yeah. Like we said,
and then do the vote.
Yeah. Another thing is when you start your discussions, this gets away from the how you make a decision thing, but it's something I failed to mention a little earlier. When you start your discussions, and I said that the first speaker is oftentimes the one where the decision gets made, and we tend to have talkers in our groups, right? People who like to talk, and they'll pipe up pretty quick. So maybe the way to kind of overcome that is for the chair to start the discussion and say, all right, let's start the discussion. Mary, let's hear from you. We haven't heard from you for a while. Pick people to discuss, to do the discussion, and start off the discussion, and kind of randomize it. That may help. That may be something that would be worthwhile to try. So, all right. That's all. That's it. That's all about group decisions. It's easy, right? No worries. You got this. It's a lot to keep in mind, but it's important stuff to keep in mind because it may help you to figure out why you're making the decisions that you are, the way you're doing them, and how to maybe get to better decisions. So, Dave, turn it back to you.